Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to one of our lunchtime series at the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences. My name is Jonathan Wassling. I'm Director of the Institute when I'm not in my role as Dean of Natural Sciences. But it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Anne Power, or rather welcome Anne back to the university. Many of you would have met Anne and possibly seen her when she received her honorary doctorate at the university in 2016. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Anne back, and it's one of the real benefits and pleasures for us when we do give people honorary degrees, that they really become part of the life and the academic life of the institution, and we're very pleased you're able to come back and visit us. Anne became Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics in 1996 and is head of the LSE Housing and Communities group, a research group based within the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion. But before that, then Anne has been involved in American and European housing and urban problems since 1965. In 1966, she worked with the Martin Luther King End Slums campaign in Chicago, and on a return to Britain organised community-based projects in Islington, Hackney and Tower Hamlets. From 1979 to 1989, she worked for the Department of the Environment and Welsh Office, setting up priority estates projects to rescue run-down estates all over the country. In 1991, she became founder of the National Communities Resource Centre at Trafford Hall in Chester, which provides residential training and pump priming support for people living in and working in low-income communities. Anne has very wide research interests, including European, American and international urban problems, crime, social exclusion, role of residents, design in relation to social organisation, social and management problems. So very, very broad interests, which clearly underpin a topic that she's going to be talking about this afternoon. Anne was awarded a CBE in June 2000 for services to regeneration and promotion of resident participation. And as you know, we awarded her a Doctor of Letters at the University of Kiel in 2016. So her talk today is going to be the future of social housing after Grenfell. Anne will consider the pressing questions around social housing, the challenge for social landlords, and the work the government must do to make social housing matter and ensure the housing rights of tenants. We very much look forward to her presentation this afternoon. We were chatting earlier, Anne is a post-PowerPoint presentation. We were talking about the various phases of giving and delivering talks, but I know one thing she's very keen on doing, as well as speaking without PowerPoint, is also engaging with you as the participating audience. So at the end of her talk, Anne's very open to questions and discussion, and I'm very happy to extend those within the hour we've got here this afternoon, so we can get as many people asking questions and discussing this afternoon. So thank you very much. Look forward to your talk and to the audience participation afterwards. Anne.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me back to Kiel. It's really a great honour to be here, and it's a lovely place to be as well. Does this sound all right, the mic? Sounds extremely weird here, but if it sounds all right to you, that's good. And I thought it was important, well, I was asked what I wanted to speak about, and at the moment I am very heavily engaged in the lessons from Grenfell. That's happened for two reasons. It's happened first because I've known the Lancaster West estate, which is where Grenfell Tower is located, since the 1980s, when I worked with the government on difficult estates, and I was kind of a walking riot person. So every estate where there was major disorder or trouble or clashes, I was involved, not in organising the riots. And that is sadly true, because those very, very difficult areas tend to have a very explosive and volatile atmosphere. And when the Grenfell fire happened, I was actually at Trafford Hall, the training centre that Jonathan referred to in Chester, running a think tank, as we called it, for the Housing Plus Academy, for social landlords on estate regeneration. So we had a room full of about 50 of the country's leading thinkers and activists around estate regeneration, and we woke up in the morning to see these horrendous pictures, and it was a very, very electrifying and horrific experience. In fact, I banned the television because it was just otherwise impossible to go on thinking about it. But following that, the LSE was asked if they had anybody who could mentor one of the tenants, who was a leading tenant on the Lancaster West estate. And they cast around for housing, and they cast around for problems and difficult areas, and they found me very quickly. And I was asked if I would do this. I was reluctant at first because I knew the place was absolutely teeming with goodwill outsiders all falling over each other to try and do something useful, and often not being actually as useful as they hoped they could be, because there were just too many of them and it was all too chaotic. But I was persuaded both by LSE and by the tenants to actually take this on. So I've been involved ever since that June fateful time, from a distance, and I've made it very clear it's from a distance. So I'm not going to talk very much directly about what's happened on Lancaster West and what's happening now, but I'm really happy to answer questions on it to the extent that I can, knowing always, please, that I'm an outsider to it and I'm just trying to help. But I'm happy to be very open, which a lot of the people directly involved can't be. So I'm going to talk much more about how it came about that such a disaster could have such a riveting effect on the country and on social landlords and tenants all over the country, and then what the follow-through has been, and whether it actually was driven by any direct or indirect causes, which I think it was, and also whether the follow-through is an adequate response, and whether the longer term will be a plus or a minus. And lots of Grenfell talks end up very unhappy, and I think actually, funnily enough, quite a lot of good could come out of this, and I'll explain why. So I'll just run through the ideas I've got. There could be many more of them, and they could be in a different order, but I'll just give my version of what I think the future of social housing is following the lessons from Grenfell. And then we can have a chat about it. So first of all, as you all know, the whole country was really shocked and really moved. And one of the surprising things that happened, and I say surprising because we were given funding to do a follow-through called Lessons from Grenfell, precisely because a lot of people thought that not enough would be done as a follow-through. In fact, slightly the opposite. There was a huge and urgent response from social landlords all over the country. So Glasgow, for example, within 24 hours visited every single tenant in high-rise, and almost the entire Glasgow housing stock of social housing, 45,000 units, is high-rise. Every single tenant was visited within 24 hours. They set up a 24-hour helpline with a personal voice at the end of it, night and day. They had all their housing stuff out in the community. That was Glasgow's response, and I could just repeat that for all over the country. Camden Council, which has 5 23-storey tower blocks all clustered together on the Chalcots estate, immediately called in fire inspectors to do an urgent fire review. They'd overclad these blocks very expensively, £25 million, I think, and were worried. There were 1,000 fire doors missing on that estate, and so they evacuated immediately. They evacuated 600 tenants. A lot of councils all over the country had 24-hour fire patrols, and a lot of councils, there are about 200 blocks, high-rise blocks in the country that have got dangerous overcladding. The government did an immediate, as you probably know, testing and found virtually every kind of insulation that was made out of that poly stuff. The scientists among you would know how to define it more closely than that. Unless it's natural product fire preventer, rock wool, for example, then it's likely to be flammable. And so there was a horrific roll call of evidence, and they found, I think, 200 plus social housing tower blocks, high-rise blocks, with the ACM cladding, which is the highly flammable, and actually condemned by building regulations. So that stuff should have never been used. So in other words, there was a lot to do. But at the same time, one of the things that was discovered was that fire checks on multi-storey blocks weren't thorough enough, and so big in-depth fire inspections were unleashed. Lift maintenance wasn't properly taken care of. Communal areas weren't kept cleared. Balconies and landings were also, tolerating refuse put out, prams put out, whatever put out, which is all completely illegal, because if you've got an emergency escape, that's your only way down, and you can't afford to have anything in the way. The other thing that was discovered was that landlords didn't know everybody who lived in their blocks. Sometimes they didn't have a proper roll call of their own tenants, but that wasn't the problem. The big problem was that the right to buy had sold on to leaseholders about 40% of the stock, and of that sold on property, about 40% was rented out privately. And those are the people who weren't known. They were the unknowns in the tower blocks. Some blocks, like Trellick Tower, also in Kensington and Chelsea, on the borders of Westminster, is 100% privately owned by leaseholders. And I don't suppose anybody's got the roll call of Trellick Tower. And it showed up that the blocks weren't run properly. There was no consistent decision-making structure. There was no one point of control. In the case of Grenfell Tower, there was no on-site management, there was no concierge, nothing. And so it was clear that there was nobody in charge with an emergency response, given how complex those buildings are. So that was a real shock to social landlords. How did it get like that? Well, so my interpretation of it was that social landlords were driven sort of from the early 80s by Thatcher, but it just incrementally got a bigger and bigger issue. And by 2010, it was like explosive. Government-driven priorities for social landlords were that they would get less and less and less grant funding to build or maintain social housing. So by 2010-12, there was no funding for maintenance or upgrading, and there was very little money to help build new social housing. And the deal was that if you wanted to build new social housing, you had to build lots of private housing for sale in order to fund the social housing. And roughly the ratio was you had to build 5 for sale in order to get 1 social housing unit. And of the 5 for sale, well, let's just leave that to one side for a moment. So it meant that the existing stock, which was 99.9% of the total social housing stock, which was owned by social landlords, received very little attention over this long period, 17 years, well, longer than 17 years, 30 years in practice, although New Labour made a big effort to kind of reverse that through the Decent Homes programme. And meanwhile, all the effort was in numbers. And if you ever hear government talking about housing policy, it's always, always about numbers. How do we get more numbers? We've got a housing crisis, more numbers. How do we solve the housing crisis? More numbers. What do we do? Build more housing. That's it. And so that was a really big problem. And social landlords suddenly realised that they'd got their priorities wrong, and that they should look at the future of social housing as the homes they got, which is what I've argued absolutely consistently since 1980 when I started working on riot-torn estates. It was obvious to me that most of those really, really difficult estates that everybody said we should demolish were perfectly savable if we ran them properly. And we proved that they were perfectly savable if you ran them properly. So the government announced a social housing green paper, which would be a root and branch review. And as a prelude to it, it unleashed the housing minister, Alok Sharma, who was new to the job, on going around the 10 regions of the UK, of England, sorry, not the UK, not Scotland, Ireland, Wales, they do their own housing, and they're much better than us, by the way. Anyway, so he met 1,000 tenants in these 10 meetings, 100 per meeting, and they've gathered up mountains of feedback from tenants. The government moved Alok Sharma on at Christmas, which is, yeah, a shame. If somebody said shame, it's a bloody shame. Meanwhile, Shelter has announced an inquiry into the future of social housing, chaired by the Methodist minister on the Lancaster West estate. The Institute of Housing, which is the professional body for housing, has launched a programme called Rethinking Social Housing, which we're part of, and we're doing the tenant consultation for that. And the leading social landlord in London, London and Quadrant, has called together a housing commission to look at the future of social housing. And he has said himself, post-Grenfell, everything is changed. We've neglected the existing stock. There's been a lot of soul-searching. All of this has been feeding into the government, and I have to say, the government, having not been their favourite person for the last 7 years, suddenly I'm the government's, I wouldn't say favourite person, but like certainly popular person, because they need to know what's happening on the ground. And the civil service has been stripped so thin that they just haven't got the capacity themselves to do the outreach. And the government quickly realised that it was deeply implicated in what had happened in the Lancaster West Estate and in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. The Secretary of State was so shocked by the fire, that's Sajid Javid. He's a well-known free marketeer who has completely changed his stripes. He went down to the Lancaster West Estate. He did it several times incognito, like not official visits. He just went in order to talk to the people on the estate and get a sort of, try and get an understanding of what had been going wrong. And it became clear, and the government announced it very quickly after the fire, that the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea was totally disorganised, totally ill-equipped for a response. It had no emergency plan. In Birmingham, when there's a crisis, every single leave is cancelled for every single senior officer above a certain level. So the entire staff, 24 hours, weekends, the lot, is on call and on duty. In Kensington, they had no system like that, so they had to call in the City of London and what was called the Gold Command to take over the services. No services functioned when this happened. And one of the really ghastly things that had happened, and it was a lot of it was driven by government cost-cutting, although the government hadn't intended what Kensington and Chelsea actually did, nonetheless the government has driven cost-cutting, and because it was a good Conservative borough and a very rich borough, it thought that cost-cutting was the name of the game. So everything was cost-cutting. Lots of services were closing, and in terms of housing, a lot of budgets were being withdrawn. Meanwhile, council tax deductions were being given to the richest band in Kensington and Chelsea. They got £100 refund in the year before Grenfell, all of them. The Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, which I expect a lot of you heard about. Nobody had heard about tenant management organisations before the fire, except me. I knew a lot about them because I'd actually set up the very first one in the country in 1976 in Islington, the Charteris Road Tenant Management Cooperative, and there are now 200 of these. These are small, estate-based groups of tenants that get fed up with the poor services they're getting and the poor conditions, and they negotiate with the council, and Islington was very go-ahead on this, to take over certain basic management like day-to-day maintenance, caretaking, environmental maintenance, support for tenants, just basic services in order to help make their area better. The Kensington and Chelsea TMO was not a TMO, it was a fake organisation. It was an arm's-length management organisation. It had originally been conceived as a borough-wide tenant management organisation, the only one in the country. It was a complete anomaly, and the government and council disbanded it in 2003, so it was not a tenant management organisation. It was very quickly banned from the Lancaster West Estate, so there was no service structure following this ghastly event when lots of people lost their homes, lost their lives, and had to be evacuated. There was just no service structure for the estate because Theresa May personally banned the Kensington and Chelsea TMO from going on the estate. The council then tried to disband it altogether, and the tenants voted against it because they wanted it to be prosecuted for what they saw as the crimes that they were responsible for. And Theresa May in all of this said something very important that was said once and then forgotten, well, was then buried. Please remember what she said. She said, "We have neglected social housing for too long. We've got to do something to reverse that." And I think that was a very interesting statement. So the things that have actually directly happened is that there's a review of building regulations. by a very feisty, important person called Dame Judith Hackett, who's strident in the extreme. I'd love to give you a whole talk about what she's got to say, but if people want to ask about it, they can. Secondly, estate management has suddenly come to the fore. You don't run estates from a town hall. You don't outsource the running of estates. You don't do it through remote control. You don't do it on the cheap. You do it on site. That's where you run estates, which was our lesson from the 1980s. Our riot estates were sorted because we fought for and secured estate-based management. So the Broadwater Farm estate is a classic example of that. And outsourcing has been the nightmare. And with the collapse of Carillion, which is not connected with the Grenfell fire, but I have to say it's very, very opportune because it underlines some of the big lessons of what happened there. So what were the really big mistakes that happened? And I'm allowed to say this, I'm not part of the public inquiry, I'm not employed by the Royal Borough, I'm not employed by the government, and everybody is under wraps, so you can't get any squeak about this from the officials. The Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, fake, which was the ALMO, agreed expensive, non-flammable cladding with the residents. And they then opted for a 4% saving on the contract, which saved them £300,000 on an £8 million contract in order to take in inflammable cladding. So they replaced the non-flammable, which had been agreed, with flammable that hadn't been agreed, in order to save 300,000, which might seem like a lot of money, but it cost £8 million to clad the Grenfell Tower. They chose the cheaper contractor who had no skills, and that contractor, you won't believe this either, subcontracted with 91 companies to deliver that work. Nobody had a clue what was going on. And the police have said that there are 320 companies in the supply chain for those 92 companies that were involved, which seems completely unbelievable. It also became clear that there was no security system, there was no single point of control when they were responsible for a 23-storey tower block. Do any of you live in tower blocks, or any of you familiar with tower blocks? I mean, you would know, if you were, that you just cannot possibly think of running a tower block without a point of control. It's just completely ludicrous. It's a highly complex, highly technical, highly vulnerable system. Any slight damage or dislocation and you're stuck, which is exactly what happened. There was no clear safety information, there were no clear emergency instructions, and 5 minutes walk from the Lancaster West estate is the Edward Woods estate in Hammersmith and Fulham. Again, I don't know if any of you know it, I've been involved in the Edward Woods estate since 1981. It's a bit of a shamefully long time, but it's true. And the Edward Woods estate has 3 23-storey tower blocks identical to Grenfell Tower. And they've been overclad with Rockwool, the non-flammable insulation. We LSE Housing, were asked in 2012, I think it was, to go and evaluate the social impact of doing the overcladding on an estate with the existing residents staying where they are. It's an entirely council-owned estate. It's got very little right to buy. It's locally managed. They had concierges in every block. They had on-site supervision of the contract right throughout, and they had an estate manager on the estate. In other words, they did it right. That was also a Conservative council. It's now Labour. And Kensington and Chelsea forgot to check out a good way to do it. Edward Woods had done it well, and Edward Woods stands to tell the tale, and it looks amazing. And it is very popular with the tenants because it's been successfully done. The other thing that was clear after the Grenfell fire was that nobody knew who lived in the block. So that's why they couldn't tell how many people had died, which is really shocking for a landlord. And the last thing that is very shocking is that there was a fire in Southwark. I don't know how many of you remember the Lacanal House fire, where 9 people died in 2009. And there was a coroner's inquiry. I thought it was a public inquiry, but it wasn't. It was a coroner's inquiry, which lasted 4 years. That's how difficult it is to get to the bottom of these stories, which made recommendations in order to avoid that kind of fire. And the government agreed to implement those recommendations. And then it forgot. I mean, it literally forgot. It just had forgotten it agreed to do them, and it didn't do them, which is shocking. If it had done them, certainly some of these things would have come to light. So there were many culprits, it was clear. So how do I think this might shape the future of social housing? Well, it wasn't a one-off. The problems have built up over a long period of time through various problems. First of all, the stock has shrunk by over 2 million. The social housing stock has shrunk by over 2 million because of the right to buy, from 6.5 million to just over 4 million. Government drove that policy and was actually intending it to make it even worse because it wanted to force housing associations to introduce the right to buy, and it wanted to force local authorities to sell off expensive stock in order to fund the right to buy for housing associations. So there was a double whammy there, which they haven't implemented. It's still on the statute book, it's still a law. They've done one pilot and it didn't work. They're about to introduce another pilot, but their heart isn't in it. And then the privatisation of services, the outsourcing of services, the Carillion Capita story. And there are some lessons that are being learnt very quickly, which includes the government, because I've been having meetings inside the government. First is focus on preserving and upgrading the existing stock. We can't afford to lose social housing. So when the upgrading of the Lancaster West estate was announced a few weeks ago, that's the Grenfell estate, they put right up at the front, there will be no demolition. It's been outruled before anybody gives any opinions. There's no demolition, which is interesting. It's known that it's quicker, cheaper, and more environmental, a lot cheaper. Even if anybody ever tells you it's not affordable to do the upgrading, it's never, honestly, never true. Unless the steel supports of a tower block are bending and you can't prop them up, and even then it's not always true, then it won't be true. It is never true. I've investigated hundreds of estates and it's never true. Thirdly, you can keep alive community stability. And what's interesting is, although these estates have a very bad reputation, in practice there are very, very few actual problem households, and most people are just on a low income. And I don't know if any of you saw the 21st floor, the Newsnight report on the Grenfell Tower. It's just the most amazing. If you can get it and see it, it's 20 minutes long. It's called the 21st floor. Amazing story, which shows that those people working, the health service, the transport sector, and other services, that they were all working except for the old lady aged 86 who died in the fire. But you can only actually reverse this bad idea that we've had, new build good, existing housing bad, and make existing housing good if you shepherd your resources and you put a lot of effort into it. And if you want to increase the stock, which has been a big driver of knocking down estates, then you can densify estates. And Savills, the big property company, and various housing associations, and I, have shown that you can increase the number of homes on most London housing estates, and they're more dense than most, by 50%, just by doing infill, adding to blocks, and using spare spaces. So there is another way. And if you can increase the stock by 50%, then you're doing very, very well, and you're protecting the entire social housing stock. So why is shrinking the social housing stock such a problem? I mean, the government didn't like social housing very much, and a lot of the public doesn't like social housing very much. So it seemed like a good idea. It's a terrible supply, because the more you shrink the housing for low-income people, the more you concentrate low-income people in a more restricted area. You then increase overcrowding, you then increase child poverty, the right to buy continues to pick off the better stock, you lose more control because as the right to buy picks off the stock, so you get lettings, private lettings within social housing, which the social landlord has no control over. And also the word ghetto started to creep in, which we really didn't think would happen in this country. And actually, they're not true ghettos in the American sense, but minority groups have become much more concentrated in the less popular housing areas. And that was screamingly obvious in Grenfell Tower. It's one of the subjects that wasn't spoken about or discussed, and still hasn't been, but it is obvious. And so as the demolition and rebuilding idea took off, as it would create mixed communities, it would provide better housing, you'd use private money from the sales in order to produce much better social housing. That argument just all fell apart because, first of all, we didn't replace the social housing at the rate that we were knocking it down. Secondly, you have to sell at very high end in order to get enough money to rebuild the social housing. Thirdly, you have to sell a lot of the property abroad because you can't borrow from banks in order to build in advance. So they were huge. And so the concentrations of poverty got a lot worse. And I'll just give you a couple of figures. 20% of the population is in the bottom 20%, obviously, but 50% of social housing tenants are in the bottom 20%. 55% of all households are in full-time work, but only 30% of social housing tenants are in full-time work. A lot more work in part-time jobs, that's true. 3% of children in owner-occupied housing live in poverty, whereas 25% of children in social housing live in poverty. So you can see a big skewing. I mean, obviously, social housing did always house poorer people, but certainly not to that extent. And so there were these 4 big drivers of social housing being in decline before Grenfell. First of all, shrinking supply. Secondly, concentrated poverty. Thirdly, remote management, lack of estate management. And fourthly, a neglect of the existing stock in favour of new stock. There was one added whammy, which was digital by default. So everything was going digital. And social landlords, this is one thing they have not learnt, and they're stupid. They really believe that you computerise rents, you computerise lettings, you computerise repairs, you computerise voids, and it's all much better, it's more efficient. And for those that are too vulnerable to switch on to computerisation, you have your face-to-face, you have your visitors, you have your vulnerable tenants service. But they forget, as a very, very prominent civil servant said, you can't manage neighbourhood conditions digitally. And if you think about it logically, what makes a neighbourhood tick and what makes a community tick and what scoops up all these problems, it's not going to be a computer, is it? So the loss of face-to-face contact, the contracting out of key functions, makes it much harder to enforce standards, much harder to know what's going on. And local authorities, as they've had cuts, so they've shrunk their capacity to do these things that previously they did face-to-face, because now, you know, you've got the computer and that saves money. So I think Newham worked out it cost 4p to do a computer transaction with a tenant. It cost 44p to do it by telephone, and it cost £400 to do it face-to-face. So guess what Newham did? Yeah, you're right. All of this was very alienating. So 2 of the big housing associations have done 2 very clever things. London and Quadrant has gone around all its staff, and it's spoken, the chief executive himself has spoken to 2,600 staff. Feedback: we're not valued, our stock is not valued. You know, you cut ribbons on new property. When did you ever cut a ribbon on an existing relet? Are you really proud of our relets? Or is it just that you're proud of it? Yeah, they felt very strongly that social housing had been stigmatised. And Genesis, that is combining with Notting Hill, both Notting Hill and Genesis have done this, have talked to their tenants, and they got the feedback that social landlords have become too commercial and they're not caring enough. And so that has really created quite a crisis among social landlords. Finally, the thing that is really important to know, if you've got rented housing, you do have to manage it. You do have to have a person who's actually in charge and in control. The Peabody Trust calls it long-term, slow, patient investment. You're there for the long term. And certainly flats require on-site management. That derives from a Victorian reformer called Octavia Hill, who argued that if you have, no matter how poor the tenants, no matter how poor the property, if you have personal contact with the tenants, you can control arrears, you can control repairs, you modify what you do according to the rent you take, you can offer support to tenants who are in difficulty, and you can manage out problems. And she proved that again and again and again. In Denmark, in their social housing sector, in Scandinavia, you're not allowed to be a social landlord without providing on-site management. You have to have a resident caretaker or a resident somebody running the estate. And so when we were doing our 1980s, what do you do about really, really difficult estates? We rediscovered Octavia Hill, and then we discovered Denmark, and that basically, so Trafford Hall was set up copying the Danish system, where tenants are all on boards, but they've received training. So we said, we've got to have a training centre, set it up, and we said, you've got to have estate-based management. Octavia Hill showed it would work, and it did work. Because complex buildings require single-point management, they require a driven system. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, following the Grenfell fire, and I had a lot of dealings with the person who was leading on what to do from the Local Government Association, took this on board based on the Broadwater Farm experience, set up an estate-based office on the Lancaster West estate, and they're now appointing a neighbourhood officer to run the Lancaster West estate. What will be really interesting is to see whether the other estates in Kensington and Chelsea get, because they're bound to fight for estate-based management. They'd have to be a bit stupid not to. So what will change? Well, there are certain things that are changing. The government's already committed to increasing the housing supply, and it did increase funding for social housing, not by nearly enough, but it's increased it. They've cooled off demolition and estate regeneration massively. They've probably now, thanks to Carillion and Capita, cooled off outsourcing. They're in a lot of trouble for it. But the other thing is they've announced for the first time a significant budget to encourage smaller housing associations. Everybody talks about these giant housing associations. Are they too big? Well, yes. Leaving that to one side, what about the hundreds and hundreds of small associations? In London, there are 320 associations under the size of 1,000 units, and they're all waiting to do stuff, but they've got no capacity. And so the government has announced this special fund for 5 years to support small housing associations, small builders, and community-led housing. And we just ran a think tank at Trafford Hall on exactly that. The next point is that there's a big return to the frontline management. I've been ringing around the housing associations to find out. So Notting Hill has gone right back. I'd say the average distribution of property to estate officer is now about 1,000 units per housing officer, whereas it's 30 properties for one employee for all the computer-based systems. So you can see how ridiculously dislocated it is. Notting Hill has now gone right back to 150 properties per housing officer. They've distributed housing officers right across their stock at that level, which is, and one other local housing association has followed. Local authorities are setting up standalone housing companies so they can build again. Tenant management organisations are outperforming their landlord, which is mainly local authorities, and maybe will grow again, which would be fantastic. There are about 200 of them around the country. Judith Hackett says that building regulations are not fit for purpose and must be reformed. I think there's got to be much more control over private lets in buy-to-let property. And I think that there's real scope for social landlords, not just to go on running social housing properly, but to actually provide, which a lot of them are already doing, what we call intermediate market renting. In other words, private renting, but with below market rents, so that people who are struggling on modest incomes, but who aren't eligible for social housing and definitely can't buy, have some chance of a decent home with long security and with a benign landlord who they can trust. So that's happening. So do I think that there's a future for social housing? This is my last point. Well, private renting is growing so fast that it's already overtaken social housing. So there are more private lets now than social lets. But it's unregulated. So from the government's point of view, it's a very, very expensive bet to put homeless and low-income families in private renting because it's so expensive. So selling off under the right to buy, and then that becoming an expensive buy-to-let, which the government then has to fund through housing benefit, which then houses homeless families. So in Grenfell Tower, there were 3 homeless families housed by Kensington and Chelsea in private lets, and they all died. So that's, you know, really brought people up a bit sharp. So I think we can expect some clawback on private renting. I think there will be some big reform of housing management. I think if social landlords go for infill development, then they can actually expand the supply, upgrade the estates, and create a better social mix on estates, simply by doing more affordable but lower cost and paying its way either intermediate renting or shared ownership or low-cost home ownership. So I think there is a possibility of returning to the original vision of social housing, where it actually plays a broader function in society and where it actually contributes more. There's an organisation being set up by 17 social landlords called Benefit to Society, which we're also doing work for, trying to prove that social housing is valuable to tenants. And we've done several pieces of work on that and found that tenants like their homes, they like their landlord, they like their community, they want to be involved, they want to be listened to, and they want to be able to do things to make their community better. And they roundly blame three things for the problems. First of all, welfare reform, which has hit very, very hard, and the austerity cuts. Secondly, poor local conditions, which stigmatises where they live, which reflects the neglect of on-site management. And thirdly, media coverage. They were able to list about 25 negative media stories and programmes that portray them as scroungers, layabouts, and so on. And they could identify very nicely about 8 benign supporting programmes. So they watch and they get very upset. So I think as long as the investment's made, and I don't think social landlords can do it on their own, the government will have to help, and there's hands-on management, there is a future. So why is social housing then so useful? Well, owner occupation is out of reach for too many modest income people, let alone poor people. Private renting is too insecure for families on low income. Housing benefit is too expensive. The public doesn't want to pay more taxes, and it's just on this trajectory. Social landlords are there for the long term, and they've got experience and track record. They can provide genuinely affordable homes, and they can also support low-income communities. So to me, it's screamingly obvious that if you want to make the housing system work and you want to actually keep about 10 million of the population going without costing huge amount to the welfare state, then you'll want to protect and encourage social housing. And I think that's what might happen, as long as we all shout loud enough. So that's...